Of why it's important. I think I'd like to illustrate that with perhaps just a small anecdote. This is somewhat frivolous, but it does actually make a serious point. And so there was a woman who went into her pharmacist, and she leant over to the pharmacist and she said, "I'd like to buy some cyanide." And he said, "Why?" He said, "Well, I need some cyanide. I want to poison my husband." And the pharmacist was rather alarmed, and he said, "Oh, madam, no, I couldn't do that. I'd be struck off. I can't give you cyanide." At this point, she calmly reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph of her husband in bed with the pharmacist's wife. And then the pharmacist leant over and said, "Oh, I didn't realise, madam, you had a prescription." The point of that is, one's perspective changes depending on context. And I think it's important we have these types of books. Thus far in medicine, in psychiatry in general, it's been very much a top-down conversation. The medical profession obviously has a lot of expertise, experience, but it's not the same as someone like Anne or many of you whom I know, actually imparting your wisdom, your experiences, and relaying those. That's a different experience altogether. And it's really because of that conversation and because of that awareness that our perspective changes. And we are constantly trying to change that perspective, make people aware of the illness, what it means for the individuals, the families, the friends, how it impacts their lives. Now, you heard a very detailed account of all the things I've done, but I really just wanted to go over a couple of the issues and what really sort of drives me. First time I came across depression was in my training, first at Cambridge and then at London, and I was involved in a very privileged group who offered surgical treatment for the treatment of depression. And I say it's privileged largely because it was very exclusive. But it struck me that it must be a very, very serious decision to be going under the knife and having a major operation, particularly on the brain. The drivers for that must be absolutely unfathomable. And so I wanted to really understand, what is it that drives depression? What drives a person to that particular extent that that decision actually seems the only rational way out to solve their problems? And so I've been looking at depression in the first instance. And then over the past decade, a greater interest in manic depressive illness, or what was formerly called manic depressive illness, but now bipolar disorder. And one of the concerns I've witnessed over the past 10 years particularly is that though our awareness of the illness has increased through functions like this, through our communication, through our dialogues, at the same time, there's also been a watering down of the seriousness of the illness. And it's really trying to maintain that balance so that it doesn't become pejorative, it doesn't become a term that has a proxy meaning and adopts all sorts of other meanings rather than what it was designed to, which is to designate something that's diagnosable, that has a serious implication, and informs us in terms of treatment. So the research, the CADE clinic, the C-A-D-E clinic, the reason for using that acronym, it stands for Clinical Assessment Diagnostic Evaluation, but it's also the surname of John Cade. John Cade was an Australian, and about 60 years ago rediscovered the use of lithium and its use for bipolar disorder. And so that's why we called it the Cade Clinic, partly because in honour of his particular pioneering achievement, but also because of the importance of assessment and diagnosis. And I think that's where we're really still not getting it right. And that's my biggest concern, is that we really need to be able to develop either a diagnostic test or other markers that allow us to be able to identify the illness early on. So one of the studies we've done recently, not directly related to bipolar disorder, but certainly related to anxiety and depression. It was mentioned I've got two daughters. One is now 16, the other's 14. And a few years back, talking to many of their friends, and they both go to the same school, it dawned on me that this is the population in which these problems start. Post-puberty, around about 13 or 14, problems start. And those problems lead to anxiety disorders, they lead to depression, they lead to, ultimately, all sorts of psychological problems. And so we wanted to identify what are the precursors. So that study we've just recently published in Biological Psychiatry, and we took a group of 60 girls, and we intend to follow them up. But with that particular 60 girls, all in the 1 year, all age 15, We administered a number of psychological tests, some clinical tests, and they're all healthy at the time, absolutely healthy. We screened them such that they didn't have any disorder, any diagnosis. They're obviously on a spectrum of whether they worried a lot, whether their mood went up or down a lot. But they didn't actually have any psychological problems per se. But then what we did was we looked at their data, and we'd stuck them in a scanner, which I'm also director of at the Royal North Shore Hospital. And we did functional imaging, whereby we were able to look at the brain in action, the blood flow through the brain, what it was doing, what they were thinking. We gave them a number of tests to engage the brain, both in terms of emotion and in terms of attention and concentration. And what we found was quite remarkable, that when we look at the data of these 60 girls, and they broke down into roughly 33 and 25, 26, thereabouts, we lost one or two in terms of the data. And we broke them into the two groups according to whether they were rather anxious or not, or whether they had greater mood symptoms or not. And remember, these are not disorders. These are just like you or I, feeling a little bit more worried or more anxious, or mood being slightly up or down. Even at that early stage, at that age, without any other medications, without any other complications, very pristine group, there was a marked difference in the way the brain was working in terms of emotion processing. The engagement of the emotion processing networks already seemed to be divergent. Now the key thing is we're going to follow these girls up in about 3 years' time, when they're 18, 19, going into young womanhood, and try to see what actually happens to them. Do they develop illnesses? And if so, which groups did so? And try to find some predictive power of what we've done. But that's really where we need to be, because in many instances we're trying to play catch-up with the diagnoses. Unfortunately, with bipolar disorder in particular, there's a delay, maybe up to a decade or so, but certainly many, many years. Part of the reason for that is it normally starts with depression, and the highs we don't really detect. And it's perfectly understandable. I have yet to see in the CADE clinic anyone come and see me and say, "Doctor, I had a great day, you need to treat me." It doesn't happen. It's perfectly understandable. If you've had a good weekend, you're doing things, why would you see a doctor? That's the last thing on your mind. And it also falls away from your memory. So try to ask people 2, 3 years ago, did you have a long period of time when you were really happy? And if you're asking students, that's really precarious. I mean, they have large periods of their lives because of all sorts of habits they have at university or otherwise, where they can't remember weekends. So it's very difficult going back to get an accurate history and make a diagnosis. So this is really why there's a drive, particularly in our clinic, to find some sort of biological underpinning. What is it that starts to go wrong? Are there specific changes within the brain that can be used to assist us in making the diagnosis? And that, I think, is really the key. In addition to that, if we do get people accurately diagnosed, what do? We need to be able to find appropriate treatments. One of the things I think that's really been very heartening is that through dialogue, through conversation, we've become much more aware of the importance of interaction, of psychological treatments, of the role of family, the role of friends, and how much support can actually change things. And it actually changes biology. And I think this is something we also have to really communicate. It's a two-way process. We used to think the brain was something that once it was set from a child into adulthood, really the nerve cells started to die and there was really very little flexibility. But actually the brain is enormously adaptable and extremely plastic, which is fantastic for us, because what it means is that even through conversation, even through social and emotional support, you're changing the brain. And so your friendly interactions with people and your conversations actually have a biological change. And hence why, in many instances, psychological therapy is equally good, if not better, than taking medication. And now the models have moved to adding the two. So you have both psychological therapy and pharmacotherapy hand in hand. And I think that's really been a real advance in the past decade or so, and I think we're at a better position now to manage illnesses like bipolar disorder. One of the key things, however, is still to really make sure that we get the diagnosis correct and then channel people to the appropriate treatments. Unfortunately, at this point in time, the illness is still, in terms of its pathophysiology, in terms of what specifically causes it, still beyond us. We can't pinpoint a particular problem, though we know that families play a role, genes play a role, the environment plays a role, and no doubt there are many other things that are also important. But I think this book, and I would like to come back to that, does also give another message, and that is that just because you have a mental illness, it doesn't actually take away from other aspects of your personality and character. And it doesn't in any way compromise you or diminish you. I think one of the things we heard about in terms of Anne being a model author is that actually writing a book is a tremendous achievement. Having written smallest books myself and writing papers, etc., I really have first-hand experience of how hard it is to transfer your ideas onto paper, and in particular in this instance, marry those to art. I think that's a really sophisticated process, and she's done tremendously well. And what the point I'm trying to make there is that art is, for us as humans, is really the highest level of functioning. It's what makes us human. If we didn't have art, if we didn't have appreciation of the things in this book, such as poetry and paintings and so on, we wouldn't characterize ourselves as we do and differentiate ourselves from other species. So, despite mental illness, it is possible to still remain at the higher echelons of ability and higher echelons of capability and still contribute. And that's another important message which I still unfortunately think hasn't really permeated into society. There is a lot of stigma around mental problems, around psychological problems, and I'm really heartened today to see so many people here on a Saturday afternoon when the sun's shining and we're in probably the best city in the world, and yet people have committed time here. So also hats off to you and thank you for coming, and once again, well done, Anne.